Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's virtual program, Leadership is Lonely, From Survival Mode to Sustainable Leadership with Allison Dearing. I am Brittany Spillman, and I have the privilege of serving as the Managing Director of the Carey Center's Community and Collegiate Programs. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors who make programs like this possible. Our presenting sponsor for today is the Walker Area Community Foundation, a nonprofit grant-making organization that works every day to build permanent resources, spark meaningful conversations, inspire action, and empower partners to make a difference. We are so grateful to our community and collegiate program sponsors, Auburn University Outreach, the Kim and Tim Hudson Endowed Fund for Excellence, Auburn University Outreach Office of Public Service, the Drummond Thorne Stooks Endowed Fund for Excellence, and a community service grant made possible by State Representative Joe Lovern. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Allison Dearing is a consultant and executive coach with Zadie Co, a social impact consulting firm headquartered in Birmingham. A former nonprofit executive director, Allison has a deep expertise in driving change, from establishing new organizations to guiding existing teams through challenging transitions. With a legal background and over 2 decades of experience across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, Allison excels at engaging with individuals with diverse viewpoints and helping leaders align their teams to achieve shared goals. In addition to her role with Zadie Co., Allison leads operations for contemplative education organizations and consults with a national judicial training organization focused on juvenile and family justice. Before we begin, I'd also like to extend a special welcome to Rosie Stafford Smith, the founder of Zadie Co. We are honored to have you joining us today and appreciate your support of both today's program and the work your team is doing for the nonprofit sector. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Allison Dearing.
Thank you, Brittany. I appreciate it. It's so good to see all of you, and gonna share my screen. Can you all see that? Okay, yay. Thank you for the thumbs up. I grew up in Columbus, Georgia, and my fourth grade teacher was Mrs. Burdishaw. My favorite thing about Mrs. Burdishaw is that she read to us every single day after lunch. I can still see myself sitting in that fourth grade classroom, loving that 30 minutes that we got to hear from her. So today, I'm going to invite you to hear a short story. Begins once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a leader. She didn't set out to become the leader. She simply cared about people and believed that she could help make things better. One day, someone asked her to lead. Who else will do it if you don't? They said. Then someone else trusted her. And before long, an organization grew around that calling. At first, it was exciting. She gathered people around the mission. They dreamed together, they built something bigger that mattered. Every challenge felt meaningful because it was in service of something bigger than herself. But as the organization grew, something else quietly grew alongside it: responsibility. The leader became the one everyone turned to when things became uncertain. She learned to answer questions no one else could answer. Would the grant be renewed? Can we make payroll? How will we respond to the next crisis? Is the board going to approve? Did I miss something? Even while she slept, those questions continued asking themselves inside her, and her body forgot what it felt like to settle. As time passed, she discovered she wasn't simply leading. She had become the fundraiser, the HR director, the advocate, the operations manager, the crisis responder, the strategist, the encourager. She carried the hopes of what could be, the fears of her staff, the expectations of the board, the questions from the donors, and the needs of people whose lives depended on the organization's work. Every day, people brought her their uncertainty, like a revolving door, in and out of her office. She quietly wondered where she was supposed to take her own uncertainty. She was surrounded by people, yet she felt increasingly alone. not because she lacked relationships, not because there was something wrong with her, but because there were fewer and fewer people who occupied her same leadership reality. Some things she just couldn't share: personnel decisions, funding concerns, strategic conversations, political realities, confidential situations. She carried stories that weren't hers to tell, but she began to believe that this was simply the cost of leadership. So she smiled and she projected confidence and she tried to reassure everyone else. But inside, another story was unfolding. I have to hold everything together. I can't let them see me struggle. Everyone is depending on me. The mission is too important for us to fail and me to fall apart. We've come too far. Who's going to do it if we don't? If I slow down, will everything break? So the leader became very good at appearing capable, and few people noticed how profoundly lonely she felt. I wonder how many of you potentially recognize pieces of that story or see yourself in any of those images that I just shared. Because our goal today is to help each other feel less alone in some of this, I'd love to invite you to put a thumbs up in the chat, a word, a yep, whatever, if anything that I shared in that story resonated with you. Thank you. And now I want to ask you to take a couple of minutes as we're settling in and do some reflection. We know we often don't give ourselves any kind of time to just sit and think and ponder and wonder because there's so much on our plates and so much that's required of us. And so I'm inviting you to grab something that you can write with, something you can write on. This is not going to be formal and no one's going to ask you to share this, but for a couple of minutes, I'm going to set a timer and we're going to be quiet. I'm going to ask you to think about these three questions. What part, as you listen to that story, felt familiar to you, where maybe you saw yourself? Is there a sentence or a phrase that stayed with you? And then where, if anywhere, have you experienced the loneliness of leadership? So if you'll do that, I'll call us back in just a couple of minutes. Okay, I'll invite us back. Thank you for taking a couple of minutes and participating in that exercise. We're going to do a couple of those kinds of reflections as we move through our time today. One of the things that I have learned is that many of us assume that these experiences that we're going to be talking about today are unique to us. I believe that's probably where I found myself, and I really didn't think there was anyone that I could talk to about it who would understand really what I was experiencing. And so, fast forward 3 years, having the opportunity to work as a consultant with Zadie Co. and to engage with leaders across the country. Surprisingly to me, guess what? A lot of people, most leaders are feeling these same kinds of things. It's a different organization, a different person, a different community, but I keep hearing versions of that same story. Turns out a lot of us are feeling this way, and there are few spaces where we feel like we can really be honest and vulnerable about the challenges. And so we know that as responsibility and leadership increases, more people need something from you. These opportunities for real human vulnerability actually diminish. And it can feel like fewer and fewer people know the real you behind the role that you hold. Our success in that role can actually increase the distance that we have from others. This leadership loneliness is not a personal situation or a failure. It is largely structural. It's not an individual experience. It is often a structural consequence of leadership itself. And as I began to understand that and looked into the research and heard and collected other stories, it was certainly validating of my own experience. And that's what I want to offer for you today. I hope that it will normalize some of your experiences as well. So, here are the goals for our time. Really, that validation that if you're experiencing loneliness in your leadership, it's real and you're not alone in that. We want to offer some space for paying attention to what comes up for you when we're talking about these things today. Maybe there are emotions, memories, stories that come to mind that might be triggered for you. Then a recognition that you may be in survival mode right now, but you are not stuck there. Um, you don't have to stay there treading the water, internally triaging all of the things on your own. There are practices and choices available that I believe can help share that load. And that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to offer some ways of thinking about things that you might, at the end of our time, consider exploring or implementing for yourself. Now, we have about 45 minutes left, and I am not delusional enough to think we can solve all of these things in a short workshop. But I do believe that you have it within you to figure out what you need and what a next step might be for you. I've seen it time and time again in coaching and working with other leaders. This is about inner work, and it's about asking yourself some of those good, hard questions and then having some space to listen to the answers that come up for you. And so I hope to give you some tools so that you can listen and then respond to what you learn. And the goal is really just to set the container for that today. And really, it's what I wish someone had shared with me. So before we get to the really good stuff, is like, what do we do about this and what are those things we can put in place to help? We need to run through how we got here, just so that we're setting the stage and we're all on the same page about this loneliness and what causes it. So hang on with me and here we go. Okay. Our workplaces are more diverse and complex than ever before. And as our organizations become more interconnected, leadership has become increasingly isolated. As you know, nonprofit leaders are navigating a systemic crisis of doing more with less, all while carrying that emotional load of mission driven work. Nonprofit leaders are expected to solve massive social problems with chronically limited resources, and we know that funding is highly competitive and pretty unpredictable. We also know that government and private sector jobs pay more than most of our nonprofits are able to pay. And so that can contribute to turnover and staffing shortages. And when that happens, who absorbs that extra responsibility? Often it's the leader. Leaders feel the burden of that ultimate responsibility for everyone's well-being, for their staff, for their constituents, for the board, the community that they're serving. Often you're holding really sensitive information as well, and that can only compound that feeling of isolation. And then because the work that we're doing is mission driven and impacting lives, when we're not able to meet every need or don't find that we have the resources that we'd like to have to offer to our community, and we have to turn people away, we know as leaders of nonprofits, we take that seriously, and that discouragement and disappointment can impact us as well. Executives become the buffer between boards who are stressed, between staff who are stressed, donors, and the communities they serve. And then sometimes there is that sense that in our role, we are having to perform. Many leaders have been taught that good leadership means projecting certainty and requires that we appear confident and optimistic and reassuring. And so we're trying to do that. And at the same time, that's really not aligned if inside we're feeling uncertain and exhausted and afraid. Sometimes we're performing that without even realizing we're doing it. And sometimes we're doing it really, really well and getting kudos from people. And that can make it even more isolating and lonely. What we've come to understand and really finally have language for is this. Many leaders spend years operating in what we know is sort of this low grade state of vigilance, where your nervous system never really gets to fully settle as those questions are continually running in the background. And for many, this chronic state of alertness, being on all of the time, becomes the baseline. So you're expected to steady everyone else, often while you are lacking that comparable support system for yourself, becoming the container for everyone else's emotions while having few places to process your own. I wonder if this sounds familiar. Everyone comes to me with all their stuff and their griefs and their conflicts and their fears, but I don't feel like I can really have a place where I can take mine. And while shouldering all of this, people describe feeling responsible for everyone's well being while they're having less and less candid conversations and feeling largely alone, which captures that emotional burden that really does extend beyond any workload. I've come to believe that this can create a disconnection from ourselves as well, which so contributes to loneliness. And when we're so busy and on that hamster wheel and consumed with all of the things in front of us, putting out the fires and the crises, always in response mode, we can lose ourselves. Nonprofit leaders become really skilled at juggling and navigating a lot of scenarios and wearing multiple hats. And we often pride ourselves on our ability to do that well. But we know that that is truly unsustainable. Being all things to all people can't really last. Jim Collins has a new book. It's What to Make of a Life. And he talks about this terminology around encoding. And if we're doing what we're truly encoded to do, that if we're not, that can create an additional layer of exhaustion where we're feeling like on the edge of what may be even our natural abilities. So holding that tension of caring for the people and our staff and our serving those that are our constituents, we're working fundamentally in a system that is often changing and there's not a finish line. These are the things that nonprofit leaders identify in the research. And as I said, they're the stories that we hear from others in our work. And so I'm imagining that you are probably identifying with this as well. So I'll say it again, this leadership loneliness, it's not a personal thing, but it is a predictable consequence of occupying a leadership role. holding that position, unfortunately, creates unexpected isolation. And the loneliness and what comes next, that predictable burnout, has little to do with a person and a lot to do with the structures and the systems that we're operating in. I've heard people say, I'm surrounded by people all day long, and I don't know that I have anybody I can really talk to. As people move up higher in their organizations, they report losing those peer relationships after a promotion, having fewer trusted colleagues where you can have really candid conversations, struggling to find other people who can really identify and understand the reality of the role, receiving less honest dialogue and feedback, all while experiencing this growing emotional disconnection. That leads us to survival mode. And so we did it. We got through that. If you're holding your breath, because I've now said all the things that keep you up at 3 a.m., I invite you to exhale and maybe reflect here for a moment. We'll just take maybe 1 minute. You can go back to that page where you were writing. And here's the question: what weight are you carrying that very few people know you're carrying? You can start it as a sentence. This is what I'm carrying that nobody knows about. It can be phrases or words. Sometimes we call it a brain dump, just get it all out. So let's take a minute to do that. Okay. Thanks for taking time to do that. Now the question is, what is this survival mode costing us? We've seen consequences of this, I'm sure, in other positions that you've held, other leaders that you've worked with and for. Survival mode looks like diminished long term vision. It looks like chronic stress, emotional exhaustion that can lead to relationship suffering, and teams that become increasingly dependent rather than taking ownership for some of their own responsibilities. And this can lead to burnout. So, loneliness and burnout are different things. They are distinct, but they often function as mutually reinforcing conditions in nonprofit leadership. So, I invite you to look at the screen the way it's broken down here, as we've just laid out. The loneliness is that experience of carrying information and making those decisions that others in the organization can't, that, feeling like you can't be fully transparent with everyone, that disconnection from peers who might have been offering support previously, and that isolation that creeps up. Burnout is fundamentally an energy and capacity problem and typically includes emotional exhaustion. We've all seen that leader who we call them crispy sometimes, right? And their responses to things are cynical. Maybe they begin to even depersonalize the constituents and the community that's being served. There can be that reduced sense of accomplishment, certainly decision fatigue, cognitive depletion from all of the things that that person is carrying, and then those physical symptoms of, losing sleep, and sometimes even physical illness, the way that that comes out in our bodies. So leadership, loneliness, and burnout do frequently converge. But burnout is less about disconnection and more about depletion. And we know there are really four stages. And so the first is when the leader becomes really sort of what they might say, I'm the infrastructure at the center of the organization, where they're holding all of those things. This is a major risk factor for burnout. So I'm holding everything, I'm holding up the sky, but who is holding the leader? Research on nonprofit executives repeatedly identifies that when there's a blurring of identity where you can't tell who is the leader and who is the organization, that is a precursor to chronic stress. The next stage is where we see that increasing isolation occurring. And so, as responsibility grows, the leader begins withholding fears and doubts and uncertainty, those personnel concerns, and do this obviously for a good reason to protect staff, to keep morale high. But the unintended consequence is that emotional isolation. And so many leaders describe feeling, I can care for everyone else, but I have no place where I feel like I can really land. Now, if the leader is a founder of the organization, they are often, as we know, symbolically central in a lot of ways. And it can seem like they are operationally indispensable, and that can actually lead to increased isolation. This third is where that carrying the load alone or feeling like you are leads to burnout. The worry, the constant ambiguity without someone to process that with. It's not so much about the workload, even though it's heavy, it's about the unshared workload, and that is lonely. And then this fourth stage, which is where the loneliness can lead to burnout, is where the system eventually begins to fail. And you see reduced creativity in the leader. You see increased reactivity, maybe to situations, compassion, fatigue, and even some numbness. And this is where you'll hear people say, I still care about the mission, but I literally don't have anything to give anymore. And that is burnout. Leadership loneliness and burnout are not evidence of weakness. They are, as we've said, predictable consequences of leading complex human systems. And this matters because if it is a structural problem, that means there can be a structural response. The loneliness that many nonprofit leaders feel isn't caused, as we said, by the workload, but it's caused by what has been termed this lack of psychological safety, a lack of meaningful connection, and not having spaces where vulnerability is welcomed rather than penalized. And so it's not an absence of relationships per se, it's the absence of people who occupy the same leadership reality. We know that leaders don't become resilient in isolation, right? We become resilient through connection. Isolation pushes us into threat mode, but connection moves us into creative mode. And so those same conditions that created the isolation can actually intentionally be redesigned to cultivate connection, resilience, healthy leadership, and flourishing. And we know at that point, the leadership changes. Okay, we're getting to the good stuff. Finally, we can talk about what are these, as I've framed them, antidotes to the loneliness. It's not about spending more time in relationships where we have a certain role, whether that's, as a director or parent or whatever role you might have, but it's about having relationships where you can remove that armor and be vulnerable, be honest, and be real. And here is what the research points to, and what I have loved over these last several years getting to see and be a part of in practice. The first is this idea of peer groups and peer coaching cohorts. They are powerful. The strongest evidence in the research points to peer communities of support as the most impactful at restoring connection and redistributing that burden of loneliness and leadership. Executive directors report almost dramatic relief when they join an executive coaching cohort or some other kind of confidential leadership circle. They're finally among people who get it, who understand. And there's this sense that I don't have to explain. You just know. When you know, you know. There's that feeling that I'm not the only one. I think if you've been struggling with that and feeling like so alone in having to carry the weight of all that, to look around and realize you're surrounded by other people who also feel that way, it's really normalizing and validating. And it's not that those people have the answers to all the questions you've been asking, it's just they're actually asking the same questions you are. And that can be that time when the struggle is shared and it feels less lonely. These groups help provide perspective. They help people understand this situation. Everyone's work has board stuff they're working with, and everyone is struggling to figure out these funding things. And so it really normalizes that experience and it expands thinking. And so you may hear from what someone else is working on, and that triggers some creative idea that you have. And so that expansive thinking is really a great benefit. And circles like this offer belonging, which may be the biggest benefit. The leader doesn't have to be the outsider there where they're the only one holding this. You got a whole group of those people together who have been feeling that way. And it's a confidential space to process together. Earlier this year, we invited, sort of as an experiment, 6 different leaders together to read and discuss Brene Brown's latest leadership book, Strong Ground. And so we set aside 6 weeks. We met on Fridays at lunchtime for an hour on Zoom. And we'd send out, a couple of chapters in advance, like just be familiar with the material, but show up even if you haven't read, because this is more about connection. And so we began each time with what we would call guiding principles, reminding everyone that everything that was said in the circle stayed in the circle, and also that no one was trying to fix or judge anyone or their situation, but you could come and be real with your peers for an hour. It was pretty amazing to see what happened, those relationships that developed. And I was thinking earlier today, the time that one of them said, what I'm about to say, if any of you all ever repeat this, I will deny it and I will say that you lied. And it makes me chuckle because that's what we're going for, right? The sense that I can be real and honest, and I trust that what I'm sharing here stays with this group. The second kind of support is that one-on-one, also confidential support. And that may be found through an executive coach, through a therapist, through a spiritual director, or maybe through all of those. But these relationships, even though each is different from the other, can become a place where the leader just gets to set it all down, to be safe, to think out loud, to say some of these things that maybe it hasn't been safe or felt safe to say in other spaces, where you can talk about how you're feeling, what you're afraid of, where you feel insecure. Many leaders experience that exhaustion, grief, also compassion fatigue, and rarely have a place to process those experiences. This relationship is where you just get to be your human self. And so through focused support that you're paying for, right? It's your time, it's set aside on the calendar, can begin to have that mental space to think about healthy strategies for stewarding your organization, not just trying to survive it. A good coach, a good spiritual director, a good therapist ask good questions that can often help identify and address some of those experiences that maybe even lead to assumptions that contribute to the loneliness. And a coach provides a confidential container for that work. It's a place to begin to reconnect with yourself, to think about these questions. Who am I outside of this role? What do I like? What do I even enjoy doing? What am I potentially carrying that doesn't belong to me? A couple of weeks ago, I received an email update from a former coaching client, and I asked her permission if I could share just a snippet of it with you. She wrote, I wanted to send a little update since you have been walking with me through this journey for many months now. You likely know more about the transition than anyone else beyond my household. I very much appreciate that I could lean on you, your calm demeanor, your wisdom, and your example during what turned out to be a very difficult few months. Knowing that we always had time on the calendar helped steady me during times that felt very unsteady and allowed me to continue keeping my own voice at the forefront rather than allowing so many other opinions and voices to pull me in directions that weren't true to my path. I think we've maybe traditionally thought about executive coaching as a luxury, and what we're seeing more and more is that it is actually standard and a necessary part of support for leaders. Okay, this third that I want to introduce is the concept of a sabbatical. And I want to say from the get go that solitude that you might have on a sabbatical and loneliness are not the same thing. Here's the paradox there. Sometimes we need temporary solitude to reconnect with ourselves so that we can meaningfully and fully connect with others. One of the biggest misconceptions, I think, in leadership is that loneliness comes from being alone, but we know that the loneliness is the absence of meaningful, relatable connections. And so solitude can actually be that time where you're cultivating that intentional presence with yourself. So the goal of a sabbatical is not isolation. The goal really is restoration. A sabbatical creates space for some of those larger questions that we were just mentioning, some of those identity questions. And in that sense, the purpose of a sabbatical isn't to escape, it is to reconnect. It turns out that belonging actually begins with belonging to ourselves. And, many nonprofit leaders in the work that is so draining often and requires so much can find that we become disconnected from ourselves. We can tell you what the board needs and what our staff needs and what everyone else is feeling, but we might not be able to say what we're feeling. We might have spent years generating meaning and purpose for everyone else, especially around our work in the community and helping other people connect to purpose, whether it's volunteers or staff that you're hiring and leading. But we rarely have the time or space to ask, does this work that I'm leading still align with my deepest sense of purpose and who I am? And so a sabbatical allows people the time and space to reflect and to consider those larger questions. It's also the time when that nervous system vigilance that we mentioned before, when you step away, it can settle and you can realize maybe that you have been living in sort of a hypervigilant state if you hadn't realized that before. I had the wonderful privilege of being granted a 3 month sabbatical during my nonprofit leadership experience. And I learned a couple of things. I learned a lot of things, actually, but a couple of very clear things. First of all, pretty immediately, I discovered I love and actually need a slower morning. I struggle to be on and out and, up and performing so early in the morning, but to have time to ease into the day, to do some meditative readings, to have another cup of coffee, to take a walk. These were the benefits of sabbatical for me that really reset a lot of things for me at that time. The other thing, I was able to do some solo independent travel and just to see the way that other cultures operate, to have the time to say, what am I going to do with this one day? And to get to figure that out really taps into and nurtures that creativity that we all have within us. And so I love getting to talk to people about my experience in sabbatical. We love helping others prepare for and plan for a sabbatical. It can have benefits for the leader, obviously, but also for the organization. And there are gaps that can be revealed, when someone steps away for a period of time, and also strengths and other opportunities when you see people step up and fill the gap. The other thing that came about for me as part of my sabbatical and in the years that have followed, turns out is supported by the research as well. Looking back on it now, I'm realizing that this kind of desire and yearning for deeper contemplative practices, for tapping into spirituality was what was happening for me and has only continued as I have had an opportunity to be away from that role. And so it turns out for long tenured nonprofit executives, the research reflects this as well. So if you think about, that desire to just have silence, if you're thinking about, oh, what it would be like to go away on a retreat for 48 hours when no one is talking, to experience just meditation, reflection, opportunities to journal, thinking about being outside in nature, we know how healing that can be. Speaking of which, I would love to build a retreat out of some of this material that we have been working through today. And so I think there's a lot here that we can touch on in an hour, but also 48 hours away with other people in a peer group. I'd love to see something like that develop, and I invite you to reach out if that's something that you might be interested in participating in. Psychologist Dr. Lisa Miller. You may have seen her. She is making the rounds on all the podcasts. She has a book called The Awakened Brain, where she defines spirituality as the deeply personal sense of connection to something greater than oneself, irrespective of religious affiliation. She ties it to neuroscience and to synchronicity. It is a fascinating read, and I highly recommend it. Before reading her book and going on my own sabbatical, I was doing some of these things already. I couldn't have told you why. I didn't have language for it, but I was drawn to, these silent retreats and opportunities to step away. Ended up even walking a pilgrimage after my sabbatical that I never would have imagined had I not had that time away. So for me, these practices have been really impactful and have created space for my own exploration and questions about my own identity and meaning making beyond any role or job that I've performed. They have nurtured that reconnection to myself, to my higher power, to others, to my purpose and meaning. We know that when we take advantage of some of these things, there are ripples to it, right? We know that flourishing leadership is not an individual achievement, it's a relational accomplishment. And leaders thrive when we have trusted places where we can belong, where we no longer have to carry the weight of everything alone. We also know that leaders who remain healthy over decades of leadership are the ones who have put into practice some of what we've talked about today. They have these structures of support that include people that they trust who are confidential, practices, some of these rituals, maybe a rhythm of life, and then communities that support them and keep them from carrying the weight of leadership alone. We know that just as organizations need strategy and governance and structure, leaders also need relationships that help keep them grounded and creative, connected, and fully human. In the times that I have heard others talk about taking one step, even if it seemed like a tiny step, there is something motivating about seeing someone else do that thing that we've maybe wondered about, that we haven't had language for, that's been maybe a whisper in the background. And so I hope that if anything that I've shared today has brought that up for you, I encourage you to lean into that and to listen. Here are some possible next steps that you might consider for yourself. Thinking about saying some of this to somebody trusted in your life that you know will keep it confidential. If you don't name that person or that person doesn't come to mind immediately, maybe there is that relationship, that intentional coaching relationship or therapy or spiritual director relationship that you might seek out where you can ask yourself in a safe environment, what am I carrying alone? Where do I need support? And so I encourage you to think about who is someone that you can be completely honest with. I'd love to encourage you to think about creating a peer group for yourself or joining one that you might find. I would love to start something else in the fall, like we did this past winter, that I mentioned. And so, if that's something that interests you, we would just want to do it, keep it small, 6 or 8 people. Could be virtual, so you could join from wherever you are. So, if that is bringing up some interest or curiosity for you, I'd love to hear from you about that. I think maybe time away, if maybe it's a vacation for you, maybe it is a sabbatical based on your tenure and your leadership. Don't be afraid to at least take one step of asking a question. Another step could be reaching out to someone who has had that experience and learning from them about it. You can take that one step, and surprisingly, sometimes that opens up a whole path. I would encourage you to think about what are those things that feed you, that soul work, that rhythm of life. Are there anchors in your day? I talked about a slower morning. I mean, what would it look like for you to change the way that you begin your day if that's something that resonated with you? What are these other things that are non negotiable to you? Can you take a walk around the block between meetings? Maybe these are things that you're already doing, but those little small steps we know can have a really big impact. And then focusing on your inner life, asking yourself those soul questions, those big identity questions, and not being afraid of what you hear. So think about that. What is one step that you could commit to taking? These are some of the texts that I've referenced. I highly recommend all of these on the list. You don't have to read them all at once, but if any of these spoke to you, I encourage you to check them out. And we'll have these here. You'll get the recording, so you'll have that slide. And this is who we are, Zadie Co. Our founder, Rosie, as Brittany said, is on the call today. And so grateful to her and her leadership and what she provides for all of us and the community. I want to have some time for you all to reflect, respond. Before we do that, I want to finish this out with a very short reading from one of the books that's on that list. It is In the Absence of the Ordinary, Soul Work for Times of Uncertainty. It's by Francis Weller. He is the author of The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which you may have read. I would say it's probably the best book on grief that I've ever read. This is a new series of essays that he's written to address the changing times that we all find ourselves in. And so I'll close us with this today, and maybe you'll have some things that you want to share when we finish. He's talking about feeling our feelings. To feel it fully, we require the arms and hearts of others, tethering us to a wider circle of belonging. The weight of grief and suffering that we are facing is more than we can hold in isolation. Be willing to share what has been gathered in your heart with another. Call 3 or 4 friends together and share the communal cup of loss that we are all feeling in this uncertain time. Be mindful of how much conditioning we have received that tells us to go it alone, to not need anyone or bother anyone else with our struggles. Challenge those thoughts. This is, as one of my teachers said, the solitary journey we cannot do alone. I wonder if you all have questions or answers or reflections that you might offer. Rosie, anything from the chat that we
Several thanks and thumbs ups for people. I'm curious if people would include maybe an action that they're going to take as a result of what they're hearing, even if it's sharing their recording with somebody else. I had a thought as you were talking, Allison, about how I think many of you are the leaders or the deputy leaders within your organizations. And maybe this is something you share with your board chair, just so that there is language for the people that are supporting you to hear it. Because in some ways, we're preaching to the choir here. But who else might benefit from having this language and understanding with you? So,
Thanks for that. There is research around really engaged boards reduce the loneliness of the leaders. I thought that was fascinating. Any other questions, reflections? Thanks, Terrence. Um, yeah, those books have been really meaningful for me. One of them that's on the list is The Artist's Way, and I don't know, I wasn't sure about our times, so I skipped over some of that. Okay, got a big nodding head. So never imagined 3 years ago when I was transitioning from leadership that it would mean so much to me to get to be in these spirituality circles working through this material that's the artist's way. My book is actually right here, but there's a group that meets on Zoom on Monday nights. We're doing it for 12 weeks because there are 12 chapters. And the whole artist's way is about tapping into that innate creativity and spirituality that each of us is gifted with. It doesn't mean you're trying to like be a great painter or write a book. It might, but it just helps us go through where are those places where we've been blocked maybe, and not being able to access our creativity in the way that we did as children. Like when we think about what it was like to play and how far we've come from being able to give that kind of gift of time to ourselves today. So, highly recommend it. If you want to be in a group for that, I'd love to welcome you into that as well. Okay, Eddie Wadworth's podcast, that House of Joy, okay, has really helped me recently, focusing on resetting mindset, being your highest best self, and discovering joy in all we do. Thank you, Amanda, for that recommendation. Okay, here's a question. How do we verbalize to new boards whose organization is restructuring and a founder ED need more support? Yeah, good questions open the conversation sometimes, when you think about information that you might be trying to convey. Um, I think, Rosie, you have thoughts about new boards that may be restructuring?
yeah, and I also want to join in this other question that Kylie just asked of how do you explain leadership loneliness to your board without sounding like complaining? Um, and I realize this is coming from a consultant, but we have also been in you all's shoes as nonprofit leaders. Often, sometimes it takes somebody from the outside saying it. And so that's where I think, is there an opportunity to share this or pieces of this with them? I think grounding what you're sharing, not in, and we often talk about making I statements, but actually in this case, pointing to the research to say, I am not alone in this, and here are the dynamics that are happening in our sector, and pointing to the research that Allison referenced earlier about this is a structural fault and not an individual failing on that person's part. So those are two things that we find is having somebody else that's not you be able to articulate, and then the second is pointed to the research that shows this isn't an individual failing. But it's hard, yeah.
Rebecca's asking about the author. It's Francis Weller, In the Absence of the Ordinary, was that passage. Thank you, Raylene, for this comment about a few minutes to stop long enough um, to think. That is part of it. Certainly, just even intentionally the writing. There's research around, the long writing, handwriting that provides for deeper and better emotional processing than even typing on a keyboard. And so we find that if you can build in a few minutes into your day to do that journaling, or in morning pages is what it's called in the artist's way. You've probably heard that reference. just something about getting it all out and being able to hold it out in front of you and doesn't feel like you're carrying it inside of you anymore. And that can actually lead to feeling less burdened by it.
Allison, thank you so much for that inspiring and insightful program today. For everyone joining us, we keep an eye out from any words are hard today. For everyone joining us today, keep an eye out for an email from me. It'll have a link to the presentation and recording and an opportunity to sign up as a Carey Center nonprofit affiliate if you are not already one. Our nonprofit affiliate program now serves more than 530 nonprofits across Alabama and beyond, and it is a great way to access educational programs, professional development, and networking opportunities, and membership is completely free. The Carey Center Nonprofit Consultant Directory, of which Zadie Co is a member, connects nonprofits with trusted experts in areas such as fundraising, board development, marketing, and strategic planning. Whether you're launching something new or solving a challenge, you can find experienced partners ready to help move your mission forward, and you can explore the directory and take your organization to the next level. Thank you again for joining us today. We hope to see you at one of our monthly virtual programs or in person when our nonprofit training series comes to your part of the state. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.